She wore white to my wedding. That was only the beginning. The photographer lowered his camera, looked at the screen, and frowned. Can we get one more? He said. Just the family this time? I was standing 2 feet away from my own husband in my own wedding dress, 40 minutes married, and somehow I was not family. I watched Vivian Ashworth step into the frame where I had been standing, loop her arm through her son's, and smile the exact smile she practiced. I am sure, for decades in some mirror in a house far nicer than the one I grew up in, nobody told me to step out. Nobody had to. I simply understood the way you understand a current pulling you under before you've even registered that you're in the water, that I was supposed to move. So I moved. I stood at the edge of that photograph, not in it, beside it. And I smiled anyway because 300 people were watching, and a black woman who shows visible hurt at her own wedding becomes, in rooms like that one, a story about her, never a story about her, never a story about what was actually done to her. I had learned in math a long time before I ever met Kevin Ashworth. I just hadn't expected to need it on the happiest day of my life. That was the second cut of the night. I want you to understand it wasn't the worst one. It wasn't even close. The dress came first, before any of it. Vivian arriving at my own wedding in white so close to bridal that an elderly cousin of mine actually leaned over during the ceremony and whispered, Baby, is that woman trying to match you? I had laughed it off in a moment. The nervous laugh, you laugh when your body already knows something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. And underneath the dress, underneath the photograph, underneath every careful little erasure Vivian had been performing on me since the morning began, there was something colder running quietly the whole time, a feeling I couldn't name yet, a feeling that would take me 5 more months and a forensic accountant's eye for patterns to finally understand by the time we reached the reception. I'd stopped laughing. Even that night, some old animal instinct in me sensed it. I remember standing at the edge of that family photograph, smiling for a camera that hadn't wanted me in the shot, and thinking, this isn't nerves. This isn't a mother having a hard night. This is a woman executing something. I just didn't know yet what. Then I watched her walk to the doors of the reception hall, open her arms, and pull a woman into an embrace so warm, so visibly relieved, that for one disoriented second I genuinely thought I was watching the reunion between a mother and a long-lost daughter. The woman was Caroline Hayes, Kevin's college girlfriend, the one Vivian has spent 6 years calling unprompted at every holiday table, every quiet Sunday phone call. The one who got away. The one I'd been promised in plain words, by my own husband would never be at our wedding. I stood there in my dress that nobody in that family had ever quite let me have, holding a glass of champagne I suddenly had no desire to drink. And I watched Vivian walk Caroline toward our table like she was delivering a gift she'd been saving for exactly this moment. I thought that was the worst thing she could do to me. I had absolutely no idea she was only getting started, and I had even less idea that the woman walking toward me in that navy dress was about to become, eventually, one of the only people in that entire room who would ever tell me the truth. My name is Denise Coleman. I was 38 years old on the day I married Kevin Ashworth, and before I tell you what his mother did to me over the 7 years I loved her son, I need you to understand something about who I was before any of it started, because the woman standing frozen at the edge of that family photo was not a woman who scared easily, and I think that detail matters. I grew up on Campbellton Road in Atlanta. In a 2-bedroom apartment, my mother kept spotless on a cleaning woman's salary, working a shift that started at 5 in the morning so that by the time I woke up for school, she'd already be home making my breakfast like she hadn't been gone at all. I became a forensic accountant because something in me, very early, decided I wanted a profession built on a kind of truth that couldn't be argued with. A number either reconciles or it doesn't. Nobody's charm, nobody's last name, nobody's seat at the right table changes what the ledger actually says. I met Kevin at a compliance seminar so boring that both of us were doodling in the margins of our handouts by hour 2. He leaned over and whispered that the coffee tasted like it had been brewed during the Clinton administration, and I laughed before I had the sense to stop myself, and that was it. That was the whole beginning. He was funny in that slightly awkward way smart, overgrown boy men sometimes are. He remembered things, small things, things I'd mentioned once in passing weeks earlier, and brought them up like they mattered to him the whole time. He cried openly the day I told him about my father, even though he never met the man, just because he could see what the memory still cost me. I want you to hold on to that detail. I want you to hold on to the version of Kevin who cried for a father-in-law he never met, because that man is also true, and this story is not as simple as a villain and the woman who loved a fool. It was 4 months in when he told me, almost apologetically, that his mother was particular. She's old buckhead, he said, like the phrase itself was an explanation. Her family's been in Atlanta since before half the skyline existed. She just has ideas about things. Don't take it personal. I should have asked him right then exactly what kind of ideas. I didn't. I was 28 months from 40 and tired of men who vanished the moment things turned serious, and Kevin Ashworth showed up. He introduced me to his father within 2 months. Walter Ashworth, tall, soft voice, the founder of the family's law firm, a man who shook my hand and then, unlike almost everyone else I would meet from that family, actually asked me real questions and waited for real answers. Walter liked me from the very beginning. I need you to remember that too because it matters enormously later and because it's proof that whatever was wrong in that family was never the whole family. It was one woman operating with a precision I completely underestimated for years. The first time I sat down to dinner at the Ashworth house, Vivian poured everyone else a wine she described, unprompted, as a good bottle, the one from our trip to Bordeaux, and handed me a glass from a different bottle entirely. Something she picked up, she said, smiling warmly the entire time at the grocery store, just in case you weren't really a wine person. I told myself she didn't know any better. I told myself a version of that sentence for 7 straight years. Clear throat. I want to slow down here because I think this is the part people skip past too fast when they tell stories like mine. The part where you're not yet angry, you're confused, and confusion is so much lonelier than anger. I sat at that dinner table holding a grocery store wine glass, smiling at a woman who had just, with total warmth in her voice, told me I probably wasn't sophisticated enough for the good bottle, and I genuinely could not tell in that moment whether I was overreacting. That's the particular cruelty of a woman like Vivian Ashworth. She never gave you anything sharp enough to hold up afterward and say, look, here, this is proof. She gave you something soft and warm sounding with a blade folded so far inside it that by the time it found skin, you were already questioning whether you'd imagined the cut. I drove home that night and asked myself out loud, in my own car, am I being too sensitive? I would ask myself that exact question hundreds of times over the next 7 years. I didn't know yet that the asking itself was the trap that became the architecture of everything that followed. Vivian Ashworth never once raised her voice at me. She never said a slur, never made a comment so blunt I could repeat it to a stranger and have them immediately understand why it hurt. Everything she did arrived wrapped in plausible deniability, dressed as a compliment timed perfectly for an audience. You're so well spoken, she told me once in front of her entire garden club in a tone that made 3 women at the table go quiet and study their plates with sudden, intense interest. I always tell people you never even guess where she's from. I'm from Atlanta, I said. Same as Kevin's from Atlanta, I said. Same as Kevin. Of course you are, sweetheart, she said, patting my hand like I'd said something endearingly naive, and turned to refill someone else's glass before I could say another word. When Kevin and I moved in together, Vivian sent a single housewarming gift, an extravagantly expensive serving platter engraved with the Ashworth family crest, with a card that read, for when you have real company over. When I made partner track in my firm 3 years into the relationship, Vivian told her friends at a holiday party, deliberately within earshot, that she was just so relieved Kevin finally has someone stable, financially, given everything, as though I were a risk he'd somehow managed to survive instead of a woman who built her own career from nothing while he was still finding his footing at his father's firm. At our engagement party, her own house, her own guest list, my mother walked in carrying a bottle of wine she'd been saving for the occasion, and Vivian glanced at the bottle, glanced at my mother, and said, oh, how thoughtful. We'll just put this with the rest, handing it to a caterer without ever once introducing herself. My mother stood alone in that foyer for 30 full seconds before I crossed the room to rescue her because Vivian had already turned, mid-sentence, to greet somebody else. Later that night, Vivian gave a toast that ran almost 4 minutes. Kevin's childhood, his accomplishments, his bright future, and ended with a single line about me and Denise. Well, we're certainly getting to know her. Polite laughed and moved through the room. The kind of laughter that lets a whole crowd agree something landed without anyone having to admit out loud exactly what. I brought every single one of these moments to Kevin in the beginning. Every time. I say, did you hear what she said? And every time I watch something complicated cross his face in embarrassment, I think, but also something underneath the embarrassment that took me years to correctly identify as fear. She doesn't mean it like that, he tell me. She's from a different generation. Just give her time, Denise. She'll come around. Give her time. I gave her 7 years. I didn't know yet that I was giving her something far more valuable than time. I was giving her my silence and silence to a woman like Vivian Ashworth. is the only currency that has ever actually mattered. There was a Thanksgiving, 4 years into a relationship, that I still cannot think about without feeling my whole chest tighten. Vivian had ordered engraved place cards for the entire extended family. The kind you have to order weeks in advance, the kind that requires someone sitting down and deciding on purpose exactly who belongs at that table and exactly where. There was no card for me. I stood in the doorway of that dining room while 12 people found their seats around a table that had clearly been planned for 11, and Vivian looked up with an expression of perfect, wide-eyed innocence. Oh, Denise, I'm so sorry. We just didn't think you'd still be coming with the roads the way they were. The roads had been fine. Kevin pulled an extra chair in from the study and wedged it into the corner of the table, off the seam where the leaf joins didn't quite align, so that for 2.5 hours I sat slightly lower than everyone else, slightly outside the actual rectangle of the table, while his mother told a long, warm, lingering story about Carolyn Hayes' family's lake house in North Georgia. And wasn't it just such a shame how things ended between her and Kevin? And then she hoped the Hayeses were doing well. I had driven those roads my entire life. I want to tell you exactly what that felt like, because I think it's the part people imagining a story like mine get wrong. It wasn't only humiliating, it was disorienting. I sat in that lowered off-center chair and felt something close to vertigo, the specific dizziness of being physically present in a room where you have just been informed, without a single raised voice, that you do not actually belong in it. I looked down at my plate and thought about every dish I'd ever helped prepare in that kitchen, every birthday card I'd sent, every ounce of patience I'd spent trying to earn a place at a table that had never once, not for one single Thanksgiving, planned on holding me. I caught Kevin's eye across that table. I wasn't asking him to fight his mother in front of 12 relatives. I was asking him, with everything I had left, just to see me, just to let his face show, even privately, even for half a second, that something wrong was happening to the woman he was supposed to marry. He looked back down at his plate. I tell you all of that not to excuse what came later, but because I think it matters that you understand exactly what I was choosing to stay for every single time I chose to stay. Kevin was not, in private, the man who let his mother humiliate me. The year my mother's blood pressure spiked badly enough to land her in the hospital for 4 days. Kevin took unpaid leave from the firm without even discussing it with me first. Slept in a chair beside her bed 2 of those nights so I could finally go home and sleep on my own. I held my hand in the hospital hallway at 3 in the morning while I sobbed into his shoulder, terrified of losing the one parent I had left. The night I made partner, he already booked the restaurant, already told the waiter in advance to bring out the good champagne the moment I walked in, already framed the offer letter and hung it in our hallway before I'd even had the chance to tell my own mother. I was married to a man capable of real tenderness who turned the instant Vivian Ashworth entered the room into someone I genuinely did not recognize, quieter, smaller, used to bow, instantly, instinctively obedient in a way that had nothing to do with how he treated me and everything to do with 38 years of being taught that disagreeing with her cost more than he could afford to pay. He was in every room that didn't contain his mother, exactly the kind of man I'd spend my 20s hoping existed. That contradiction was the hardest part of loving him, and I think it's the part people who haven't lived it never quite believe. It would have been so much simpler if Kevin had been cruel everywhere. Instead, that was the year I started keeping a list. Not for revenge, not yet. I started it because I needed proof, somewhere outside my own head, that these things were actually happening. Because Vivian was a master at making each individual cruelty small enough, alone, to doubt. A missing place card, a grocery store whine, a comment about being well spoken. Each one, by itself, a woman could talk herself out of for years. I know, because I did exactly that for years. Together, written down in a worn spiral notebook I kept in my nightstand drawer, they began to form a shape I couldn't unsee. I didn't know yet how useful that notebook would become. I didn't know yet that I was, without realizing it, building the first piece of evidence in a case that would eventually end Vivian Ashworth's entire carefully constructed life. It took me years to fully understand the actual shape of what I was dealing with, and I want to walk through how I finally saw it clearly, because I suspect a lot of you watching this have lived some version of what I'm describing and have spent just as long calling it something smaller and softer than what it really was. It was Susan, Kevin's older sister, who finally said the true thing out loud. Susan and I had never been close. She kept her distance from Atlanta and most of the family drama for years, living in Charlotte, and I'd long assumed she simply didn't notice or didn't care what her mother did to me. One Christmas, after Vivian had spent nearly an hour describing a sorority sister's daughter's wedding to a lovely boy from a lovely family, the kind of match everyone just expects, Susan found me alone in the kitchen rinsing wine glasses and said without any warm-up at all, she did this to David too, my ex-husband. Not the same way, but she made his life hell for 2 years because his family didn't have the right last name. This isn't really about you. Denise, it's about what she thinks she deserves to be seen with. What does that mean? I asked. Exactly? Susan glanced toward the dining room where her mother's laugh carried through the wall. I lay beside Kevin, running Susan's words over and over, because they finally gave language to something I'd felt for years but never named. This had never been about my credentials, my manners, my flowers on Vivian's birthday for 6 years straight. The homemade soup I drove 45 minutes out of my way to bring her the one time she had the flu, only to watch her open the door, glance at the container in my hands, and say, oh, Nate, it means my mother has spent her whole life building a very specific picture of this family, and you don't fit the picture. It's not that you're not good enough, it's that you're not what she already decided the photograph was supposed to look like years before you ever existed. I didn't sleep that night. I thought Kevin was sending something from the good deli. There was nothing I could have done. No version of myself I could have built, however careful, however accomplished, however well spoken, that would have ever satisfied a woman whose problem with me had been decided before I ever walked through her door. And Caroline Hayes had lived exactly like the picture in Vivian's head. What I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't learn for another 3 years, sitting at my own kitchen table at midnight with a spreadsheet open and a stranger's voice on the phone, was that Caroline Hayes had not actually fit that picture either. Not in the end. Vivian Ashworth's idea of who deserved to stand beside her son was not fixed. It moved the instant it needed to, the instant the person standing in that frame stopped being useful to whatever Vivian needed the world to believe about her family. I had years left to go before I understood that the woman I envied at my own wedding had already survived and barely the exact same machine that was currently working on me. I confronted Kevin about it directly, finally, about a year before the wedding. We were in our kitchen and I asked him straight out, does your mother have a problem with me because I'm Black? He didn't answer right away. That silence told me more than anything he eventually said after it. It's complicated, he finally said. She grew up in a different world. Denise. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying I don't know how to undo 40 years of somebody's thinking. I can only control how I treat you. Except you don't, I said. You let her do this. Every time you tell me to be patient, and I've been patient for 6 years. He reached for my hand, and for the first time, his voice cracked when he answered. You think I don't know that? You think I haven't spent my whole life watching her decide things for everyone around her and being too scared to say anything? I watched her end a friendship I had in fourth grade because the kid's family lived in the wrong zip code. Denise, I was 9. I cried for a week and she told me I'd thank her one day. I've been losing arguments with my mother since before I could read. I don't know how to win one now. I want you to sit with that for a second, the way I had to, because that confession didn't excuse what he let happen to me. Nothing excuses 7 years of silence. But it complicated him in a way that made walking away so much harder than it should have been. I wasn't married to a man who agreed with his mother. I was married to a man who had been taught his entire life that disagreeing with her cost more than he could afford to pay, and who had simply never found, in 38 years, the courage to test that belief. I love you, he said. I'm marrying you. That has to count for something. I wanted it to count for everything. So 3 months later, when he proposed on a hotel rooftop with a string quartet he'd hired without telling me, I said yes, and I told myself that once we were legally bound, permanently, undeniably married, Vivian would simply have no choice left but to accept it. I was wrong about almost everything that year, but I was especially wrong about that. The wedding planning should have warned me if I let myself read it clearly instead of explaining it away one decision at a time. Vivian inserted herself into nearly everything, not as a helpful future mother-in-law offering opinions, but as a woman who behaved consistently as though the wedding belonged to her and merely featured us. She vetoed my chosen caterer in favor of one her garden club used, because we have a reputation to maintain, dear, and you wouldn't know the right people yet. She told my florist behind my back to swap the deep reds and golds I requested, flowers that reminded me of my grandmother's garden, for pale blush and white because it photographed so much more elegantly, don't you think, for a more traditional look. I let some things go. I drew one hard line. I told Kevin that if his mother invited Caroline Hayes to our wedding, I would walk. He promised me she wouldn't be there. I believed him. Hold on to that. Hold on to it the way I should have held on to every warning sign that had been quietly stacking for 7 years, because that single promise and my decision to trust it completely is the exact hinge this entire story turns on. 3 weeks before the wedding, I discovered Vivian had quietly altered the reception seating chart Kevin and I had finalized together. My side of the family, my mother, my aunts, my cousins who had driven hours to be there, had been moved to 4 tables near the kitchen entrance, where servers would pass through every few minutes carrying trays close enough to brush their shoulders. The Ashworth side sat in the center of the room, closest to the head table, closest to the dance floor, closest to every photograph that would ever be taken that night. I caught it by accident, cross-referencing the final floor plan against the version Kevin and I had approved. The same careful instinct that would later expose so much more than a seating chart. I fixed it myself, quietly, the week of the wedding, and said nothing to Vivian at all. I didn't have the energy left to fight a battle. I'd have to fight again the moment I wanted. I just wanted for one day to not be moved. I didn't know yet how thoroughly that wish would fail. On the morning of the wedding, sitting in the bridal suite getting my hair finished, my own mother leaned over and whispered, "Baby, that woman's wearing white." I laughed it off, certain she meant something close to ivory, certain that surely no woman alive would deliberately wear a bridal colored gown to her own son's wedding. I was wrong about that too. By the time the ceremony began, I'd already absorbed the dress, already absorbed 3 separate comments about Caroline Hayes from Vivian's side of the aisle before I'd even finished walking down it. And I told myself, this is my day. I will not let her take this from me. I walked down that aisle on my mother's arm. My father had passed when I was 19, and I carried the weight of his absence the way I always do at moments that should be whole. And I married Kevin Ashworth in front of 300 people, and for nearly 40 minutes, standing at that altar, looking at him, I let myself believe it was actually going to be okay. Then we walked into the reception, and the photographer asked for one more, just a family this time, and I watched Vivian step into the frame where I had been standing 30 seconds before. And then I watched her cross the room and pull Caroline Hayes into the kind of embrace you give someone you genuinely miss. I found Kevin's eyes across that reception hall the same way I had at that Thanksgiving table years before, and for one terrible second I watched something move across his face. Shock, maybe, or shame. I stood alone at my own wedding reception in the dress that had never quite been allowed to be only mine, watching my husband of 40 minutes embrace the woman his mother had spent 7 years romanticizing in front of me, and I felt something I can only describe as a kind of public drowning, fully visible, fully alone, with 300 people close enough to reach out and pull me up and not one of them moving. I genuinely could not tell which. Then I watched him do the thing I should have known by then that he was always eventually going to do. He smiled. He crossed the room. He hugged Caroline Hayes hello in front of every single person we both knew. Whispers started almost immediately, traveling table to table like smoke. Didn't even know she was invited. Vivian must have. Wonder how Denise feels about an aunt of Kevin's. A woman I genuinely liked found a reason not to be in the next family photo at all. A cousin who hugged me warmly an hour earlier suddenly couldn't quite meet my eyes when I walked past her table. Then Vivian took the microphone for the toast nobody had asked her to give, raised her glass, and said, smiling out at the whole room, "To old friends and new beginnings." Her eyes found Caroline's across the floor as she said it. The room clapped, politely, uncertainly, the way a crowd claps when it senses something is wrong but cannot yet name it. And I stood there holding my own champagne glass, watching my mother-in-law toast my husband's ex-girlfriend at my wedding reception while everyone in that room decided in real time whether to pretend they hadn't noticed. I didn't cry. I want that on the record because I have cried plenty of times in this story, alone, in cars, in kitchens, but I did not cry that night because some old stubborn part of me decided, somewhere around the third wave of whispers, that Vivian Ashworth was not going to get to watch me fall apart in public. I danced with my husband. I cut the cake. I smiled in every photograph I was allowed to remain in. But something in me shifted permanently before that night ended, something that would take 5 more months to fully sharpen into a plan. I had spent 7 years giving Vivian Ashworth the benefit of every conceivable doubt. Standing in that reception hall, watching my new husband's arm around his ex-girlfriend's shoulders while his mother glowed at the two of them like a director admiring her finished scene, I understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that I had married into a family that had never once planned for me to actually stay. I lay awake most of that night convinced I understood exactly what had happened in that reception hall, and I want to admit, honestly, how wrong that certainty turned out to be. I decided somewhere around 3 in the morning that there had been two women working against me at my own wedding, not one. I replayed the way Caroline had let Vivian pull her into that embrace without any visible hesitation. I replayed the easy, practiced way she'd let Kevin hug her in front of 300 people, the comfortable angle of her smile, the fact that she'd shown up at all instead of declining an invitation she had to know was a knife aimed at me. I built a whole theory that night, lying in the dark beside the man I just married, that Caroline Hayes had wanted Kevin back, that she and his mother had been quietly working toward this exact moment for longer than I wanted to imagine, that the warmth in that doorway hug had been real on both sides. I decided I hated her almost as much as I hated Vivian, and I held on to that conviction for months. I was wrong about exactly half of it. It would take me 5 more months and a single phone call to understand which half. 3 weeks later, completely by accident, I found out exactly how far Vivian Ashworth had already gone to make sure I wouldn't. Our wool says a sec brown with a sickly with my job, and I think there's its own kind of justice in that. If you believe in that sort of thing, I'd recently taken on as a quiet favor to Walter an informal look at some discrepancies in the books of the Ashworth Family Foundation, the charitable nonprofit Vivian had chaired for nearly 2 decades, the one that funded scholarships and ran an annual gala Vivian liked to describe as the social event of the Buckhead calendar. The foundation's longtime accountant had retired, and the new one kept flagging small inconsistencies he didn't have the authority or maybe the nerve to chase down further. I told myself I was just helping Walter. I didn't go looking for anything. I genuinely believed that the first night I opened the files. By the fourth hour, I no longer believed anything quite so simple. What started as a handful of oddly timed transfers became, the deeper I went, a pattern that made the back of my neck go cold. Over nearly 6 years, more than $400,000 had moved out of the foundation's restricted scholarship fund and into a personal account traced through two shell transfers and a holding LLC registered to a P.O. box in Marietta directly back to Vivian Ashworth. Each individual withdrawal was small enough to slide under the foundation's audit threshold, 8,000 here, 11,000 there, small enough that no single transaction would ever raise an alarm on its own. It was the same exact technique she'd used on me for 7 years, nothing ever sharp enough alone to prove anything. Only the pattern, laid end to end, told the truth. I sat at my kitchen table at 11 that night with that spreadsheet glowing in front of me and felt something cold and final settle into my chest. Because the next thread I pulled was worse. 2 years before I ever met Kevin, Vivian had refinanced the family's lake house, the same lake house she so loved mentioning belonged to people like the Hayeses, using a signature on the loan documents that didn't match Walter's signature on a single other paper I could find across 20 years of his legal career. I'm not a handwriting expert. I didn't need to be. The loop on the W leaned the wrong direction. The pressure was wrong. Sitting there at my kitchen table, I understood that the woman who had spent 7 years deciding I wasn't sophisticated enough for the good wine had forged her own husband's name to take out a loan he very likely knew nothing about on a property that public records suggested was now two missed payments from default. The woman who told me I wasn't good enough to be photographed beside her son had been secretly drowning financially for years and stealing from a children's scholarship fund to keep herself afloat while she did it. There was one more document in that same box of old foundation records, dated almost 11 years earlier, that I didn't fully understand the weight of until much later, and I want to tell you about it now because it changed something fundamental about how I understood the woman I was dealing with. Eleanor Whitfield was white, old Atlanta money herself, married into a family every bit as established as the Ashworths. And the only thing I could find that distinguished her from any other woman in that social circle was a single line in the old board minutes document. She had announced, the year before those letters started, her intention to run for foundation chair against Vivian. It was a brief, brittle newspaper clipping about a board leadership challenge, paired with a folder of anonymous letters sent to half of Buckhead accusing a board member named Eleanor Whitfield of mismanaging foundation funds. The accusations were never substantiated. Eleanor withdrew from the race, then from the board entirely, then, according to a follow-up clipping 18 months later from her own marriage. I sat with that folder for a long time because I had spent years believing the central engine of everything Vivian Ashworth had ever done to me was the simple, ugly fact that she didn't believe a Black woman was good enough for her son. I want to be completely clear. I wasn't wrong about that. The wine from the grocery store, the missing place card, The comment about being well spoken, that was real, and it was racism plain and specific, and nothing I found afterward erased it or excused it. But sitting with Eleanor Whitfield's folder open in front of me, I understood for the first time that race had never been the entire engine. It was simply the sharpest tool within reach for whatever target stood in front of her at the time. Vivian Ashworth would destroy anyone, any color, any background, any relation by blood or marriage who threatened the very specific architecture of control she had spent her whole life constructing. I had been only half the picture. Caroline had been another piece of it. Eleanor Whitfield, a woman who looked nothing like me and shared every social credential Vivian valued, had been ground down by the exact same machine for the exact same reason. She had simply gotten too close to taking something Vivian believed belonged only to her. I didn't tell Kevin that night. I want to be honest about exactly why, because the answer surprised even me. Part of it was strategy. I already knew how quickly this family closed ranks, how fast Kevin defaulted to defending his mother, how skillfully Vivian could reshape a story before the truth ever finished landing. But the larger part was colder and more personal than strategy. I thought about the missing place card. I thought about the grocery store wine. I thought about Caroline Hayes' arms around my husband's neck while 300 guests watched me stand alone at my own wedding. And some old, exhausted, endlessly patient part of me, the part that had been quietly swallowing humiliation for 7 straight years, finally and quietly decided not anymore. Not through screaming, not through tears. Nobody in that family would ever take seriously anyway. Do something undeniable. I was going to build a case, the same way I build one for any client. Documented, verified, bulletproof. It would take me 5 months. And I still didn't know that first night that the most painful discovery of all wasn't even in that spreadsheet yet. It was sitting in a phone call I hadn't worked up the courage to make. I kept the spiral notebook from years before in the same drawer, and I started a second one beside it. Dates, amounts, account numbers, photographs of documents I had every legal right to review, cross-referenced against public property records, against old emails Walter forwarded me without ever realizing what he was actually handing over. And eventually, after weeks of working up the nerve, I called Caroline Hayes. I expected an enemy. I found instead a woman who had spent years quietly furious at Vivian Ashworth in her own right, for reasons that, once she explained them, made the floor of my own understanding tilt sideways. She told me Kevin cheated on me, Caroline said, her voice flat with old, settled anger. Senior year, right after my dad's business went under and it hit the papers. She told me she'd seen the text messages herself. I broke up with him over something that never happened. Denise. I didn't find out it was a lie until 2 years later, and by then, it didn't matter anymore. I'd already lost time I can't get back. Why would she do that? I asked, though some sick part of me already suspected. Because the instant my family became an embarrassment, I stopped being the girl she wanted her son with, Caroline said. She just needed Kevin to be the one to end it so it would never look like her decision. That's the part that took me years to see. She never tells you no herself. She just makes sure you say it for her. There was a longer silence on the line before Caroline added something I hadn't expected at all. She called me, after the breakup. Twice a year for a while, just to check in. Always so warm I used to think she still cared about me, even after Kevin and I were over. It wasn't until your wedding invitation showed up that I understood what those calls actually were. What were they? Maintenance? Caroline said quietly. She was keeping a door open in case she ever needed it again. I think some part of her always knew Kevin might marry someone she could use me against. I just never imagined it would actually happen. When the invitation came, I told myself I was only curious. I think the truth is, some old heart in me wanted to see him again, and she knew exactly which door to open to get me into that room. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up, because it reframed everything I thought I'd understood about that night. The one who got away had never gotten away on her own. Vivian had pushed her out the same careful, deniable way she pushed me to the edges of photographs, and then spent years keeping her warm in reserve, a weapon she could deploy the instant she needed one. I had spent my entire wedding reception envying a woman who had been carefully, patiently engineered into a tool, the same way I was now becoming evidence in a case I hadn't yet decided how to use. Caroline didn't hesitate when I asked if she put what she knew in writing. I think I owe somebody the truth, she said. I thought I was the only one she ever did this to. I didn't know there'd been a whole line of us. I didn't tell her everything I found about the foundation yet. Not because I didn't trust her, by then strangely. I did, but because I was still confirming, still cross-checking, still making absolutely sure that when I finally laid this out, there would be no soft edge anywhere for Vivian Ashworth to push against. and collapsed the whole thing into Denise misunderstood or Denise is just bitter about her wedding. I had no idea calling Caroline that first time that the most dangerous moment of the entire 5 months was still ahead of me. A single careless evening that nearly handed Vivian everything before I was ready to use any of it. It happened on a Sunday, about 3 months into building the case. I brought my laptop to dinner at the Ashworth house, intending to finish an unrelated report in the car beforehand, and I left it on the back seat instead of locking it in the trunk, the way I trained myself to do by then out of pure habit. Vivian, of all people, offered to help me carry in a dessert and reached into the back seat for a serving dish sitting directly beside that laptop bag. My stomach dropped so fast I nearly knocked a candle off the porch railing, reaching past her to grab the bag myself. Let me get that, I said too quickly, my voice not quite steady, and she gave me a strange look, not suspicious exactly, just puzzled at how fast I'd moved, before shrugging it off and walking ahead of me into the house. I sat in my car for a full minute afterward, hands still shaking, before I went inside and ate dinner across the table from a woman who had no idea how close she'd just come to finding the very thing that would end her. After that night, the laptop never left the locked drawer at my own house again. I started keeping printing copies in a safe deposit box besides because I understood sitting at that table forcing myself to eat exactly how much was riding on nobody finding what I had before I was ready. I want you to understand something about that period because I think it's the part of stories like mine that gets skipped past too quickly when people imagine revenge. It wasn't satisfying yet. It was lonely in a way I had never been lonely before because the secret I was carrying was too large to share with the one person I'd normally have told everything. There were nights I almost broke. I lie next to Kevin, listening to him breathe and feel the entire weight of what I knew pressing against the back of my teeth. And I think, just tell him. Just hand him the spreadsheet and let him decide what kind of man he wants to be. And then I'd remember the missing place card. I'd remember the parking lot promise that Caroline would never be at our wedding. I remember watching him hug her anyway in front of everyone, and I'd swallow the words back down and wait one more night. There was a night, about 4 months in, when I finally had to tell Walter something was wrong because I'd reached the point where the foundation's exposure had grown too large to keep handling alone. And because of everyone in that family, he was the only person I genuinely trusted not to warn her first. I drove to his office after hours, the two of us alone under fluorescent light with a folder between us on his desk, and I watched him go very still as I walked him through the first dozen transfers. There has to be an explanation, he said, the way I imagine men like Walter always say at first, out of 40 years of habit more than belief. I looked for one for 4 months, I told him. I wanted there to be one too. He was quiet for a long time after that, turning a pen over in his hands, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone somewhere I'd never heard it go before. If I tell her I know, he said, before this is ready, she'll find a way to make it disappear. She always has. I left his office that night with my chest tight in a way I hadn't expected. Relief, mostly, that I finally had one person inside that family who knew the truth and hadn't reflexively defended her, but also a colder fear underneath it. The fear that now lived with me every single day until the gala. If Walter slipped, even once, even accidentally, everything I built for 4 months could collapse before I was ready to use any of it. I need you to promise me you'll let the board handle it properly when the time comes. Not me. I don't trust myself not to protect her, even now. He never slipped. I want that on the record too, because Walter Ashworth, whatever else his story takes from his family, deserves credit for carrying a secret that heavy for 2 more months without once letting it show. And there was Vivian herself during those 5 months, somehow finding new ways to wound me without ever once knowing she'd already lost. At a spring luncheon, she introduced me to a new garden club member as Kevin's wife. Well, you know, the one from the wedding, letting the sentence trail off just long enough with a woman's eyes to flicker with recognition, with pity, with the specific cruelty of being known by strangers only as the punchline of someone else's gossip. I smiled through it. I had gotten frighteningly good at smiling through it by then because for the first time in 7 years, her words could no longer actually reach the part of me that mattered. I already knew the truth underneath everything she still believed she controlled. Then Walter mentioned, one ordinary Sunday in early spring, that the Foundation's 20th anniversary gala was approaching, bigger than usual this year, with a special program planned to honor Vivian for 2 decades of selfless service to this community. A Lifetime Achievement Award presented by the Foundation's board in front of every major donor and old money family in Buckhead. I remember setting my fork down very carefully when he said it. I remember looking at Vivian's face glowing with the anticipation of that honor, and feeling something inside me settle into place with the quiet, final click of a lock finally turning all the way. I knew right then exactly where this story was going to end. What I didn't know yet was how many more secrets were waiting to surface in that single room before the night was through, or that the most painful one wouldn't be about money at all. Subor. The gala was held downtown in a glass-walled hall with views of the skyline. Vivian liked to mention her family had watched Grow since before half of it existed. 400 guests. A string section, a step and repeat with the foundation's logo, where Vivian posed in a gown the color of champagne, glowing with the particular satisfaction of a woman who believes completely that the entire night belongs to her. I had spent the prior week meeting quietly with Renata Okafor, outside counsel the board had brought in independently the moment I presented my documentation and set of accusations. I gave her everything: the transfer records, the property documents, the forged signature comparison, sworn statements from two former foundation staff members who'd noticed similar discrepancies years earlier and been quietly let go before they could push further. I had not given her Caroline's story because that wasn't a financial crime. It was simply the truth about who Vivian Ashworth really was beneath the lifetime achievement gown, and I decided that particular truth belonged to Caroline to tell on her own terms if she still wanted to. She did. She came as my guest. Vivian saw her in the lobby and pulled her into another warm embrace, completely unaware that the woman in her arms had spent the last hour with me going over exactly what she planned to say if the moment came. The program began the way these things always do. A welcome from the board chair, a slideshow of 20 years of scholarship recipients standing in front of college buildings they would never have reached without that fund. I watched Vivian's face during that slideshow and saw real pride in it. And for one strange, unwanted second, I almost felt something like pity, watching a woman about to lose everything she'd spent decades building, blissfully unaware the floor beneath her had already collapsed. The pity passed quickly. I thought about the children that money was supposed to reach. I let it go. The board chair invited Vivian to the small stage to receive her award. She climbed those 2 steps in her champagne gown to warm applause, Walter beaming beside her, Kevin clapping at our table with what looked painfully like genuine pride in his mother. I watched him and understood he still had absolutely no idea what was 3 minutes away from happening. Renata took the microphone next, ostensibly to read the formal citation. She read the first 2 lines exactly as written. Then, in the same even legal voice she'd used to read a contract clause, she said the line we'd agreed on together. Before we close tonight's program, the board has asked me to address a matter that, in fairness to this organization's donors and the families this foundation exists to serve, cannot wait any longer. The room went silent in a way I have never heard 400 people go silent before. I watched Vivian smile whole for exactly 1 more second, then falter at the edges. Renata laid it out plainly. The pattern of transfers, the Shell LLC, 6 years of withdrawals from the Restricted Scholarship Fund, the total now confirmed at $412,000. She named no one directly in that first breath. She simply read the numbers, the dates, the account trails, the way a prosecutor reads evidence into a record, letting the facts do the only thing facts are built to do. I watched 400 faces turn almost as one toward the woman standing frozen at the podium in her lifetime achievement gown. "This is a misunderstanding," Vivian said, her voice climbing half an octave, reaching instinctively for the smile that had carried her through every uncomfortable moment of her entire life. "I think there's been some confusion with the accounting. That's a forged signature on the refinancing of a property held jointly with your husband," Renata said, still calm, still even. "We have an independent handwriting analysis as well. Mr. Ashworth has confirmed he never signed it." I looked at Walter. I will remember the look on his face for the rest of my life. Not anger yet, not even shock exactly, but the slow dawning collapse of a man realizing in real time in front of 400 people that the floor of his own marriage had been hollow for years and he'd simply never been allowed to feel it shift. That was when Caroline stood up. She didn't ask for the microphone. She didn't need it in the room that quiet. "I want to add something," she said, her voice shaken but clear, "because I think people in this room deserve to know what kind of woman they've been honoring." She told them about senior year, about the lie about Kevin's cheating, about her father's bankruptcy, and how fast Vivian's warmth had curdled into something engineered to end the relationship the moment Caroline's family stopped looking respectable enough to be useful. "She didn't lose me," Caroline said, looking directly at Vivian now. "She got rid of me. The same way I'm starting to understand she's tried to get rid of every woman who wasn't exactly what she'd already decided her son's wife should look like." Every head in that room turned next toward me. I didn't stand to deliver a speech. I know what this kind of story usually promises, the dramatic monologue. The mother-in-law sobbing while the crowd applauds the wrong woman's righteous fury. That isn't what happened, and I have come to believe the truth is more satisfying than that fantasy ever could have been. I simply stood, smoothed my dress, and said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, I'd like to thank the board for handling this with the seriousness it deserved. Then I sat back down and I let the silence do what silence does so much better than screaming ever could. Vivian Ashworth stood alone at that podium in her champagne gown, in front of every major donor, every old family, every person whose respect she had spent 2 decades carefully cultivating, and there was nowhere left to direct the blame, not at me. I hadn't said a single sentence that could be twisted into bitterness. Not at Caroline, who had nothing left to lose and no remaining reason to lie. Not at a lawyer who had only read numbers aloud. She had built her entire identity on being seen a certain way by a certain kind of room. And in front of the only room that had ever truly mattered to her, that identity finished collapsing in real time with 400 witnesses. Coke. Kevin found me in the parking garage 20 minutes later. I'd needed air, needed distance from the wreckage of that ballroom, needed 5 minutes where I wasn't being watched by 400 pairs of eyes deciding in real time how to feel about what they'd just seen. Did you know? His voice was wrecked in a way I had genuinely never heard from him before. I found it by accident, 5 months ago, working on the foundation's books for your father. 5 months. He said the number like it was an accusation in itself. You sat on this for 5 months and didn't tell me? I turned to face him fully, and I felt for the first time in 7 years completely calm in a conversation with anyone named Ashworth. I sat on it for 5 months because every single time I've ever brought you something uncomfortable about your mother, you've defended her. The missing place card, the wine from the grocery store, inviting Caroline to our wedding behind both our backs. Every time you told me to be patient, to give her time. I had $400,000 of stolen scholarship money and a forged signature on your father's house. Kevin, do you really believe, even for a second, I thought you'd have done anything but try to find a way to protect her from it? He opened his mouth to argue, and I watched him realize in real time that he couldn't. She's still my mother, he said instead, quieter now, and there was real grief in it. I know that's hard, I said, but Kevin, you let it cost me 7 years. He leaned back against the car beside us, and something in his face finally broke open in a way I had never once seen in 7 years together. You think this is the first time she's done something like this, he said. You think I just grew up scared of her in some general way and never tested it? I tested it once. Law school, my 3rd year, I got into a fellowship in Geneva, international human rights work, the kind of thing I actually wanted to do before I let myself believe I wanted the firm instead. I told her I was going. 2 weeks later, she collapsed at a luncheon right in front of half her garden club and was rushed to the hospital with what the doctors eventually called a stress episode, not a heart attack, nothing that ever showed up again on a single test afterward. I sat in that hospital room for 4 days, certain I was about to lose her, and when she was finally discharged, she held my hand and told me how relieved she was that I'd already decided to withdraw from the fellowship to stay close to home. I hadn't decided that. I don't even remember saying it out loud. But somehow, by the time I left that hospital, everyone in the family already believes I had, and it cost too much to correct them. I never applied for anything like it again. I told myself for 15 years that I simply changed my mind. I'm only telling you right now, tonight, that I don't actually believe that anymore. I understood something far sadder and far more complicated. He had been built deliberately, the same way Caroline had been removed and Eleanor Whitfield had been ruined, engineered, piece by piece, by a woman who could not tolerate anyone close to her, including her own son, slipping outside the picture she had decided their lives were supposed to form. I stood there in that parking garage and felt the entire architecture of 7 years rearrange itself in front of me. I had spent so long believing Kevin was simply a weak man who chosen comfort over courage again and again at my expense. Listening to him in that moment, it didn't excuse the silence he'd handed me for 7 years. I want to be honest about that too. But it explained, finally and completely, exactly what that silence had cost him to maintain his entire life, and exactly why he had never once had it in him to choose differently. The grief of a man watching the only authority he'd ever fully obeyed turn out to be exactly as hollow as the rest of us had been telling him for years. I know, I said. And I'm still the woman you watched in alone at our wedding reception while you hugged your ex-girlfriend in front of 300 people. I'm still the woman without a place card at 4 straight Thanksgivings. I have spent 7 years waiting for you to choose me out loud. Kevin, not in private after the fact in a parking garage, in the room, in front of her. I needed you to choose me in the room even once, and you never did. What do you want me to say? Nothing tonight, I told him, and I meant it completely. I want you to sit with everything you just watched happen in there. I want you to think about every single time I told you something was wrong and you told me I was imagining it. And I want you to understand that whatever happens next between us, I am finished being patient with people who only manage to see me clearly once the consequences have gotten too large to hide. I drove myself home. He didn't try to stop me. In the weeks that followed, the Ashworth family came apart the slow, ugly way these things actually happen. Not in one dramatic scene, but in 100 smaller ones. The foundation's board removed Vivian formally within a month and turned the financial irregularities over to outside counsel for further action. Whether criminal charges ever followed was frankly out of my hands by then, and I made peace with not needing to control that part. Walter filed for separation 11 weeks later, a decision I genuinely believe broke something in him that had been quietly cracking for years before I ever entered the picture. The realization that the woman he built a life, a marriage, and a law firm around had been lying to him in escalating ways for longer than he could bear to calculate. Several of the garden club friends who'd once laughed along with Vivian's comments about my being well spoken quietly stopped returning her calls. Old money forgives a great many private sins. I learned, but it does not easily forgive being made to look foolish in public in front of the only audience that ever mattered to it. I saw Vivian once more at a brief, miserable family meeting Walter's attorney arranged to discuss the separation. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, not humbled. I don't think Vivian Ashworth was built for humility, but cornered, the particular smallness of a woman who has finally run out of people willing to pretend along with her. She caught me alone near the elevator afterward and said, in a voice stripped of all its usual warmth, I hope you're satisfied. I told her honestly that I wasn't satisfied at all, that I spent 7 years simply hoping she would treat me like a person worth respecting, and that none of what happened at that gala had ever been about satisfaction. It had been about a children's scholarship fund she drained for years while deciding I wasn't good enough to sit at her table. She had no answer for that for the first time since I'd known her. Vivian Ashworth had absolutely nothing left to say. Susan called me, for the first time in our relationship, as something other than polite holiday small talk. Thank you, she said, for finally making it impossible for anyone to look away. She told me months later that she kept her own private record of her mother for years and had simply never believed anyone would take it seriously enough to act. I told her I understood that completely. We still talk regularly now. Caroline Hayes and I, of all people, became something close to friends. We still check in with each other. There's a particular bond that forms between two women who realize, often too late, that they were never actually rivals. We were both just targets of the same person, set against each other by design, taught to envy exactly the woman we should have recognized as another casualty. And Kevin and I'll tell you honestly, because I promise you the truth and not a fairy tale. We didn't divorce immediately. We tried counseling. He apologized more than once in ways that sounded sincere, and some of them probably were. I believe even now that he loved me as completely as a man taught his entire life to fear his own mother's disapproval was capable of loving anyone. But I had spent 7 years learning exactly what it cost me to wait for that courage on a delay, and I was not willing to spend the next 7 doing it again. We separated 8 months after that gala. I won't pretend it didn't hurt. Loving someone and finally seeing them clearly are not mutually exclusive, and grief doesn't care whether you were right to walk away. There was one more discovery still waiting for me, and it came almost as an afterthought, the kind of paperwork nobody thinks to open until a marriage is already ending. The wedding photography studio closed out our account in the new year and forwarded as a courtesy the complete project file, contracts, invoices, and every email that had passed back and forth in the weeks before the wedding. I almost didn't open it. I am grateful now that I did. Buried in that folder was a message Vivian had sent the photographer 6 weeks before the wedding under the subject line, Family Portrait Guidance, Ashworth Wedding. It read like an ordinary planning note, right up until I reached the shot list itself, a number breakdown of every formal portrait scheduled for the reception, each one annotated with exactly who should appear in frame. 4 of the 7 listed portraits were marked and Vivian's own clipped. Precise handwriting, Ashworth family only, immediate bloodline. My name did not appear once across any of the 7, including the ones explicitly labeled for the bride and groom. I called the photographer the following week, more out of disbelief than any real plan to use what I'd found. He remembered the request clearly, and he sounded genuinely sick once he understood why I was asking. I just thought it was a family tradition, he told me. Some families do that immediate bloodline only for certain portraits, in-laws photographed separately. I'd never worked a wedding with a request that specific before, but I had no reason to think it was anything other than what she told me it was. I followed the brief I was given. I had absolutely no idea. He hadn't done anything wrong. That was the part that sat heaviest with me after I hung up the phone. He was a professional who'd been handed clear, confident instructions by the person paying the invoice and had simply done what any photographer would do with a brief that specific. It had been written down in complete sentences 6 weeks earlier on a laptop in a quiet office with the exact same careful, deniable precision Vivian Ashworth brought to absolutely everything else she ever did to me: the missing place card, the wine from the grocery store, the seating chart she quietly rearranged 3 weeks before the wedding. The cruelty hadn't happened on the dance floor that night, in some spontaneous flare of jealousy or an overwhelmed mother's bad behavior. None of it had ever been an accident of nerves or the unguarded slip of an emotional mother on her son's big day. It had been planned, scheduled, itemized, line by line, like a budget. I had spent more than a year believing the worst night of my marriage was the product of one woman losing herself in the moment. It wasn't. It was the final, fully executed phase of a plan she had already finished building before I had even chosen my flowers. People ask me sometimes, hearing this story, whether I regret not confronting Vivian Ashworth sooner, whether I should have screamed at her at that wedding reception, thrown a drink, made the kind of scene she clearly believed deep down that a woman like me was always one provocation away from making I understand why they asked. We're taught, especially women who look like me, that our anger only counts as legitimate if it's loud, that quiet is somehow the same thing as weak. I don't believe that anymore, if I ever fully did. I think about that family photograph constantly. The one where the photographer asked for just family and I stepped, without being told, out of my own wedding portrait. For years, I told myself a story about that moment, that it was nerves or an old woman's bad night, something that happened to me rather than something done to me. I know better now. I have the email. I know it was written 6 weeks earlier in complete sentences with a numbered list attached. That photograph is proof of exactly how much work it took her to keep me out of the frame, work she had scheduled in advance, the same careful way she scheduled everything else, because some part of her always knew, even then, that I belonged in it. You do not need a written shot list, a missing place card, a borrowed seat at the edge of a table, a wedding dress worn by someone who isn't the bride, if the person you're trying to erase was never actually a threat to begin with. Vivian Ashwood spent 2 decades in a stolen scholarship fund trying to keep me at the edges of her family's photograph. And in the end, it was the truth, plain, documented, undeniable truth, that finally put her at the edge of her own. I walked out of that marriage with my name, my career, and my self-respect fully intact. And I walked out of it without ever once becoming the cruel, vindictive woman Vivian always seemed to expect. Eventually, that I would. I didn't need cruelty. The truth, laid out plainly enough, was always going to be more than enough on its own. They're doing it because your presence threatens a picture they've spent a lifetime building, a picture that was never going to have honest room for you in it, no matter how patient you were, no matter how perfectly you learned to set the table, no matter how many photographs you let yourself be quietly removed from before you finally understood you were allowed to stop stepping aside. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. The people who spend years making you doubt your own worth are very rarely doing it because you actually lack any. Know your worth long before anyone else is forced to recognize it. By the time they finally see you clearly, you should already be standing on ground steady enough that their permission no longer matters at all. I know mine now. I learned it in a borrowed chair at the corner of a Thanksgiving table, in a wedding dress, standing alone in the crowded room, watching a camera flash for a photograph I wasn't in, at a kitchen table at midnight with a spreadsheet open and a cold cup of coffee going colder. But I learned it. And no one, not Vivian Ashworth, not the family that once decided I didn't belong in their picture, not even the man I loved enough to wait 7 years for, gets to take that away from me again.